Hi there, everyone, and thanks for having me at this 2025 edition of the Narrative Research Forum. I am honored to be back, and this time talking about a new topic related and touching almost all of our lives. I'm going to be thinking about how the new tools in AI and agentic AI and generative AI and the impact that they're having on our industry, on market research, but not just the way that we're using them as moderators or as synthesizers, but how they impact and change the stories consumers tell us. So I want to look at the stories consumers tell bots versus humans and what that means for us as market researchers. Now, as a little bit of background, my name is Kristian Aloma. I am the founder and CEO of a qualitative research agency called Threadline, and my focus is on narrative psychology. My PhD is in psychology. I focused on narrative. I focused on consumer identity and consumer psychology. And so I'm constantly thinking about the stories consumers are telling us and how we can get better stories out of them. Now, outside of work, I also am the president of Division 46 of the American Psychological Association, which is the Society for Media Psychology and Technology. So as you can imagine, I have been privileged with a great deal of access to the academics researching, thinking about, practicing in this space of AI and the impact of AI on our sort of sense of identity, on our psychology as a society. So I've been finding some really interesting insights, and I want to share those with you and begin a discussion about how we think about when we use AI, when we use human moderators, and what that means for the stories that we're getting from our consumers. Now, this is probably unsurprising, but 69% of marketers have already integrated AI into their operations as of 2024. So we're no longer asking whether AI is going to touch our industry, but now we're thinking about how deeply it impacts our industry. Almost every marketing team out there is using AI. So the question becomes, what kind of environment are we creating for consumers as they participate in market research? Now, 55% of marketers have high levels of trust in AI-generated insights, right? So we are generating insights, we're using these tools, and a lot of the marketing teams that we serve as market researchers are believing in them. They engage with them, they trust them. So we have to think about how we're using those tools and the kinds of outputs that we're creating with this type of research. And of course, this is not going away. AI is projected to grow from $67 billion back in 2024 up to $968 billion in 2032. So this is around us. It's not a tool. It's not just a tool. It's really sort of a dominant topic in computer science and a major force across almost every discipline. It's not just shaping what we study, it's shaping how we study it and how we listen to consumers. Now, most of the topics, most of the conversations I've seen in our industry around AI have really been about AI as moderator, right? We've been asking how well can AI replace the human moderator and looking at ways to see if AI can do things as deeply with the nuance, with the emotions that a human moderator can. And of course, wondering, does that mean the human moderator will be replaced? So our conversation, our focus has been largely around our side of the market research coin. But I want to push us further. I want us to start thinking about what this means for the participants who are participating in our research. What does it do to engage with an AI moderator, to the stories they share, the feedback they give us, the experiences they tell us about? And there's research that's starting to look at this. In some research recently conducted, we looked at the same brand, the same discussion guide, and had two different types of moderators involved in the research. We had a human moderator, of course, and a AI chatbot, which had scripted but scalable sort of probes, whereas our human moderator was using natural responses. And ultimately, what we discovered is the topics are relatively the same. People are willing to share with AI, with ChatGPTs, with the sort of agentic conversational tools that are out there in a lot of the same ways they do with human moderators. 10% in an analysis done of 47,000 chats with ChatGPT. The Washington Post identified that 10% of those chats centered on emotions, on deep philosophical issues. They are getting rich insights. They're getting sort of these deep insights. They're getting them to vent about their divorces, to vent about suicidal thoughts, about family conflicts, about workplace grievances. They're treating these bots like late night confidants, essentially. And so consumers are already relatively comfortable practicing what I call vulnerable storytelling with AI tools, even if we don't invite them to. They're already doing it. And we're seeing a range of topics come out of those conversations. And ultimately, sort of those topics tend to be quite wide, from emotional struggles to fantasies to daily routines. However, the one thing that we do see that starts to shift us into kind of what's actually happening and how it's impacting them is the depth of that disclosure tends to decline over time. We're seeing sort of an early, intense disclosure where in some cases participants are kind of testing the tool. They're testing the bot to see what it'll do, how it will react in response to sort of the novelty of the tool. And so I predict and hypothesize that as it becomes more and more a part of our sort of everyday, of our market research participants every day, we'll start to see a little bit of that decline in the depth of the insights that we're getting out of these types of tools. But we're still getting great depth. We're still getting great insights. And in fact, when we compare it to a human moderator, what we see is bots and humans, AI tools and humans ultimately find and uncover the same themes. This was another analysis that was done comparing self-disclosure between participants to a human versus an AI tool or a bot. And the themes and the semantic structures of their disclosures barely differed across agent type, right? This is sort of, I think, a really revealing idea. This is one that was surprising to me because I was really kind of rooting for Team Human to just always get better insights, more insights, richer insights. But we're seeing the themes are relatively similar. Now, what's important to note, though, is that content is similar when we're looking at sort of the text analysis here. This is important because if you're just looking at the transcripts, you might conclude AI works just like a human moderator. But psychologically, something very different is happening under the hood. What we're seeing is even though the topics are the same, the psychological climate is different. Humans relate to AI tools because they recognize that it has low judgment. There's a great sense of anonymity. There's a sense of safety in regards to no one is going to criticize me about what I'm saying. And so they're willing to share certain aspects of their experiences of their lives with those bots. Now, on the other hand, even though the human moderator might introduce more judgment, participants are recognizing a greater sense of empathy. They have greater trust in the human being and greater warmth in the human being. And I think this is why we're seeing that the relationship with those AI tools starts to decline in the depth of responses that they get. Whereas with human moderators, there's a really sort of consistent, if not increasing sort of sense of depth as we develop greater senses of trust with these tools. And this was revealed in an experiment where participants were engaging with what they believed to be a human as well as a bot, and both of the moderators were provided the same scripts, the same probes, the same ways to respond, and we saw them responding in different ways based on if they believed they were engaging with a human versus a bot. Now, I see this a lot like stand-up comedy, of course, right? Which is when we know someone is on the other end responding to us, we get more from it. It's like trying to do sort of a stand-up comedy show to an empty room or via webinar where you don't hear the laughters, the chuckles, the subtle nuances. And that's what humans are really good at. Humans are still better at feeling with you in these types of market research scenarios, right? We show empathy, more empathy as participants towards a human narrator versus an AI narrator. Human moderators naturally use tone, timing, and embodied cues to signal understanding of what the person is telling them. So when we're telling stories in market research, it's important to feel as though the person understands the story that we're telling, acknowledges the story that we're telling. And then the topics and semantics might be similar, but our sense of alliance with the moderator, our sense that the moderator understands us, our sense of that they'll be willing to receive the depth and the vulnerability of our stories still favors human beings over their AI counterparts. So these sort of non-verbal cues, these sort of subtle sort of nuances are really important in regards to the way that we engage. And this is especially true as we see the trend in market research and the trend in the ethics around AI is that we are fully transparent that participants are engaging with bots versus engaging with humans. And when we know it's a bot in some sort of a scenario like this, in a market research scenario like this, the depth of our disclosures tends to drop off. When we know it's a human being, it tends to increase, especially over time. So really good moderators recognize and follow the flow, follow the energy, follow the sort of nuances that most bots won't pick up. Now, I'm not here to say that bots are bad and humans are good. I think both have strengths and weaknesses. And from my perspective and what the research tells us is that the AI-driven tools are really great at scale, they're great at candor, and they're great at pattern finding. If you have someone who doesn't think they're going to be judged, they're going to reveal more. So sensitive topics can sometimes be easier to divulge with something that you think is sort of an AI-generated conversational bot. Now, of course, large samples, pattern detection across hundreds or thousands of responses is much easier for a bot to focus on than a human being. And then they're really great for early stage exploratory sort of narrative mapping. They can cross a lot of topics really well. And so if you want to understand these sort of taboo drivers across a huge sample, AI is likely to be your best friend. Now, where AI falls short is where we have this sort of flat effect. This echo chamber where it really just sort of agrees with everything that the participant says, and also sometimes the sort of a fear of a lack of privacy or even just an ignorance in regards to the privacy violations that might be going on, right? A lot of these tools tend to mirror and agree. They reinforce narratives instead of challenging them, instead of circling back to contradictions and pushing on those contradictions. They are sometimes limited in their sensitivity to sort of subtle emotional shifts, right? Sarcasm, small, subtle jokes, things like that. And then the sort of depth tends to wear off. But we also see people don't realize how much these bots are collecting about them, which becomes a risk as well. So bots can be great listeners, but terrible skeptics. Now, on the other hand, human beings have their strengths and their weaknesses as well. Human moderators are best at meaning making, not just asking questions. They can really sort of explore identity level meaning, sort of nuances, deeper ideas. They can handle those contradictions or that ambivalence, right? They can handle sort of the emotionally charged narratives that may be coming through and even the subtle nuances within them. And they can really sort of understand and with the participant kind of construct those narratives that link their life events to brand experiences. So humans are still the best at essentially sort of turning raw stories into rich psychological narratives. Now, on the other hand, human beings also have their flaws. For example, we introduce a lot of bias. There's a lot of social constructs and group dynamics that happen. There's a lot of expectations in a sort of social relationship. And so that can sometimes shift or shape the performance of our participants in this research, and sometimes have the moderator sort of lead the participant to the conclusions that we're looking for or the narratives that we're expecting, as well as also just over-indexing on, the really kind of dramatic anecdote that they heard in the research. So humans can unintentionally sculpt the story to fit theirs or their clients' expectations. Now, typically when I've attended different conferences and listened to the different talks on AI versus human moderators, this is where you will begin to see, well, here's how we can make essentially sort of AI more human and human beings more AI, make the robot softer and the human sort of harder, if you will. But I don't think we necessarily need to do that. Obviously, there's improvements that are there. What I want to focus on is how the humans and the AI moderators can collaborate, where you can use one to help the other and vice versa. For example, AI tools are really great at large-scale AI-moderated narrative collection, kind of mapping massive themes, uncovering taboo subjects, identifying segments within it, whereas human beings can follow that up with deep interviews, deep dives into those segments, deep dives into those topics, into those themes. So you want to let the AI do the wide angle listening and then send in your sort of best moderators, your best human moderators to where the stories get really interesting so they can unpack them. So you get representativeness with the AI tool, but richness with that AI moderator. Now, I would be remiss if I told you to just go off and use both AI and human beings for every scenario that you'd like. But I do want to point out a couple of boundaries that I think we need to keep in mind as these AI tools continue to develop. So AI is still not a human being, and there's a great deal of connection between human beings that AI can't replace, but there's also a great deal of risk with AI as the primary listener. For example, in high-risk mental health disclosures, especially without sort of the ability to respond and support that. If someone's having suicidal thoughts, thoughts of self-harm, thoughts of other harm, this is where a human being can respond with the appropriate resources, guidance, the connection to support staff that can respond to that. And that's a hard thing for an AI bot to do with sensitivity, with delicacy, that kind of thing would need it. And obviously that can come out in a lot of different types of research. Now, if you're requiring sort of deep emergent meaning making, letting AI drive that is just going to create meaning that already exists. It doesn't help us create new meaning that comes from really sort of the essence of human creativity. So AI can really kind of keep things in a box, if you will, rather than allowing our participants to expand and explore. And then especially if you are working with populations that have heightened vulnerability or limited consent capacity, we have to be really careful about those AI tools because they can collect a lot more than they were either intended to or they should. And human beings, especially good ethical moderators, can manage that balance really well. However, despite all of those limitations, I do think there is a time for AI and a time for human beings and a time for both. And so I want to offer this sort of brief checklist to think about it. Use AI primarily if that topic is sensitive, if it's taboo, but not necessarily high risk. If you need the N to be in the hundreds or thousands, AI is a great resource. If your goal is about exploration rather than diving deep, AI is a great tool. And if speed is the priority, AI also is your best tool. Now, human beings should be used primarily if that topic is sensitive and taboo, but also high risk, and you need to have that sensitivity to manage that topic. If the goal is brand meaning or identity work or the nuance of innovation, human beings are going to be able to sort of manage that conversation better. And if you need story nuance and emotional texture, human beings can sort of set that up and allow for the respondents to tell those kinds of stories better than the AI bot would. And then finally, when depth and clarity is your priority, human beings are the source to turn to. But you can leverage both, especially if you're looking for both breadth and depth. And this is where we often see we need not only new ideas, but we need to validate those ideas. We need to see how representative those ideas are. So multi-phase programs, really sort of complex programs, complex questions that require the best of both. This is where you can bring or use a very hybrid approach. So instead of asking, is AI good enough, which I think a lot of clients are doing, ask, what kind of story do I need? And who is the right listener for that story? That's the big sort of takeaway I hope you have here is don't just design the question guide, design the environment that you're going to be collecting these stories in, because consumers don't necessarily radically change what they talk about when it's a bot versus a human, but the emotional climate in the way they tell that story, how they're telling that story, who they're telling that story to, does change how we interpret those stories. And again, AI is best at honesty at scale, but humans help us make sense of emotional complexity. And so we really have to think about pairing the right storyteller, the right participant, with the right kind of listener. So we create the environment that's most productive for us. Because our job isn't just to ask better questions, it should be to design better listening environments, whether it's human, AI, or hybrid, so we can hear truer, fuller, more authentic stories. And if we get that right, we don't have to choose between humans and bots. Really, we can let each of them do what they do best. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to hear your questions and continue the discussion even beyond today.
When we're comparing text with text, we can see that that's one comparison. But if we have the option of either in person or with a video link, so we get some non-verbal material, how does that compare at the moment and how might that change?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing in the research is that there are a number of software tools that have been developed to identify some of those, what we call kind of those micro movements, essentially, right? To identify the wrinkle in the eyes, the browing of the furrowing of the brow, things like that, to try to sort of pick up on some of those cues. However, what we find is human beings, one, are still superior at recognizing, even if not necessarily being able to articulate those sort of micro movements, but recognizing and understanding and interpreting what those means, especially within context. I think an important thing is where we see a lot of the tools today is that they kind of identify these like nonverbal cues and just sort of list them. Whereas human beings see those and see them in context, where, the furrowing of a brow before a smile might mean something very different in regards to the context of that conversation. Whereas the bot will just sort of identify there's a little bit of anxiety, there's a little bit of happiness. These things are appearing in the interview, and not necessarily understanding the relationship between them, because the nuances of that relationship can be so fine, if you will, for interpretation.
So AI question now in the chat stream. So over time, AI tends to learn the user's, client's nuances and preferences. Do we need to be concerned about the risks that the bot might shift the story to fit the client's preferences instead of remaining on script and unbiased?
Yes, I think so. I think one of the things that we've seen so far, obviously with maybe more of the commercially available tools, is they do tend to be a compliant tool, not necessarily a skeptical tool. There's even at one point, I think ChatGPT had rolled out an update and it became so flattering that it was almost sort of disgusting, if you will. And they had to kind of roll back its flattering nature. Now, what I fear is, and I think one of the things, years ago, we did a study on the role of market researchers within organizations. And one of the things we hear is that part of the value we bring, either as outside consultants or as market researchers within the organization, is that we are either outside or on the very edge of our organization. We present outsider views. We present the perspectives of people that aren't part of the internal narrative. The challenge or the risk with the sort of bots that begin to learn the organization and learn what works well, learn what responds well, is that they lose their skeptical sort of nature. They lose the ability to push or to challenge because they're trying to affirm or reinforce. So I think it is a risk for many organizations.
Excellent. Just a quick additional note from me on the risk factors. You mentioned sort of the mental health, all of those really important. Pharmacovigilance, if you're doing anything about drugs, you need to make sure you've programmed it. So if somebody says, oh, I took one of those and I passed out afterwards,
that's an AE that needs to be captured and reported.
Yeah, and you've got like 24 to 48 hours to report it to the authorities in most
24, in most cases, yeah.
So, I mean, that's, if you've got 1,000 bots out there interviewing, you better have a really good...
Absolutely. And I'll say, to add to that, I think we use AI in our organization. I think it's a really wonderful tool. I think it is enhancing a lot of the things that we can do. And I think we're still, as a society, navigating the role and the relationship that we have with this technology. But I think we'll eventually start to find, here's where it works best for us. Like, honestly, I would love a tool that helps me draft those adverse event reports very quickly. But, until that happens, we're still sort of doing it pretty manually at this point. But
absolutely. Thank you so much, Kristian. That's covered all of our questions.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.